Saint Augustine of Hippo was one of the greatest theologians and well-known Christian church leaders of all time. Many traditional interpretations of the Bible, including divine grace and original sin, were of his conception, and his works provided the inspiration for nearly every well-known Christian leader since. Perhaps St. Augustine's greatest ever contribution to apologetics was his claim that at any time when a biblical concept is shown to contradict the discoveries of science, then the biblical concept must be reinterpreted into a metaphorical statement. However, despite this progressive ecumenical line of thinking, Augustine was also guilty of hypocrisy by shunning other progressive discoveries of his time, such as the antiquity of the Earth, in favour of the familiar falsehood of an Earth less than 6,000 years old. Creationists watching now, of course, wouldn't bat an eyelid at this, as they themselves persist in this delusion, although they attribute the alleged calculation of this period to Bishop Ussher. Furthermore, in his unfinished work De Genesi ad Litteram, Augustine used the passages of Genesis to prove the Aristotelian idea of spontaneous generation to be true. From that point on, spontaneous generation persisted as a central tenet of Christianity even after Greek philosophy's influence on Christian thought declined at the turn of the last millennium. Spontaneous generation became a more and more vital element to both the progress of science and Christian theology, with naturalists and apologians even using it as external proof of biblical concepts such as the creation myth and the Immaculate Conception, just as modern creationists use the disproof of spontaneous generation as proof of almost exactly the same biblical concepts. Creationists often cite Louis Pasteur as a creationist and opponent of evolution, when in fact this is entirely untrue. Pasteur was, like John Needham, the experimental defender of spontaneous generation, a Roman Catholic and believed in the glorification of his religion, but he was an acceptor of evolution and a methodological naturalist who himself disproved religious concepts such as the demonic theory of disease. He was, however, a cautious skeptic of Darwin's, as he wrongly claimed that natural selection lacked the testability of experimentation, a feature of science Pasteur was particularly clinical and zealous about. He was one of several of Darwin's contemporaries who did not accept natural selection, at least initially, but did accept the well-established concept of evolution, albeit one of the many unscientific views of transmutation in circulation at the time. In fact, it was only around this time, specifically 1868, that the term creationism was even coined, and it was so as the description to the opposition to the now established fact of evolution, and in some cases merely the theory of natural selection. Along with Pasteur, many other pioneer scientists of the Enlightenment period have had their name tarnished with this label, in an attempt by modern creationists to make their now discredited position seem credible. The majority presented on these lists are clearly absurd to be touted as such, having been born, made their contribution to science, and even died up to hundreds of years before the publication of On the Origin of Species. These people were pioneers in science in that they discovered something previously undiscovered. It's merely a trivial fact that of the many fields they pioneered and many things they discovered, the fact of evolutionary biology was not one among them. Others in the list, such as Lord Kelvin and Henry Faber, are posited as being supportive of things they weren't, or denying things they didn't. And others, such as Louis Agassiz, were proponents of anti-evolutionary positions that creationists nowadays claim evolution to be the implementer of, in this case scientific racism. Of the remaining 8 in Morris's list of 33, 2 were creationists in the same sense of denying that evolution of any kind occurred. John Ambrose Fleming, whose claim to fame was an electronic invention, and George Stokes, pioneer in mathematical physics. The fields of study pioneered by these Christians into essentially a rediscovery and empirical refinement of ancient Greek philosophy have in more recent times been refined and even corrected themselves by non-Christian and often atheist scientists. Not to mention it is mostly their discoveries which creationists repeatedly show their ignorance or denial of and attempt to obstruct in their long-standing campaign against scientific progression. This fact is not just prevalent in modern times, with the continuum of more die-hard creationists correlating with lesser and lesser credible ideas, it also extends back to the time of the so-called creationists who pioneered early Western science. This is a testament to the ever-changing zeitgeist of religious views, as we today consider these historical figures to be incredibly pious, but in their times their discoveries and even personal beliefs were met by the zealots of their time with accusations of impiety, apostasy and heresy. One of the final great ironies of this whole point is that while the religious are and always have been notorious for their obstruction of scientific advancement, the only time atheists have ever maligned scientific fact with such zeal is when they do so directed against what are generally regarded as the evolutionary sciences. Broadly, atheism may and has had such exponents, but these distinct groups are differentiated for their anti-scientific, anti-materialistic, and most intriguingly, anti-secularist ideology. Creationists claim scientific skepticism as the reason for their systematic denial of empirically verifiable phenomena, which is why they rarely, if ever, dare allow an analysis of their personal beliefs. Only an impossibly unreasonable burden of proof can be applied to deny what is collectively known as evolutionism, but the smallest of analytic criticism can deconstruct any and all claims creationists hold, be it biblical or simply unique of mainstream discovery.
We cannot afford to take mythology at face value.
This is why creationists of the more respectable persuasion attempt to distance themselves from their religious origins and ambitions, and why in any discussion on intelligent design, the one and only resounding blow that needs to be made to defeat their credibility is the rudimentary task of exposing intelligent design as not only implicitly, but purely religious. Demonstrating the intelligent design movement as self-aware creationism reveals that they are everything creationism is. A religiously driven and indefensible stance with, despite their claims, no scientific program, methodological proponents, nor credibility. Creationists instead attempt to tarnish the credibility of those who have it, eagerly distorting the words and contexts of credible individuals so as to reference them and any view they may hold legitimately as equally tenable as the falsehoods even they are too embarrassed to admit. The final scientifically argumentative piece of hypocrisy exposed here is that although creationists constantly claim that the science of evolution is eroding away and on the verge of collapse, every foundational argument ever proposed by the modern creationist movements are addressed and rebutted immediately by the scientific community with a multitude of evidence. Creationists are without positive indication, which is why creation science is a misnomer. Those creationists claim to have convinced discover their reasoning to do so as a foolish misinterpretation of personal gaps in knowledge, while other creationists openly admit that they embrace their beliefs in lieu of scientific knowledge and in reckless abandon of it. Their institutions tout statements of faith in which they must forbid themselves to discover anything in contrast or even beyond their preconceived conclusions, and rather than taking Augustine's advice of reconciling religion and reality, they deny reality and they admit it. Science is by definition agnostic and would never claim the presence or absence of any number of gods. How could it when there isn't even a consistent, meaningful definition? Science cannot test nor invoke the supernatural because anything supernatural is transcendent of all detection and has only ever manifested from a lack of rational understanding in an attempt to explain natural phenomena. Creationism is not a tenable alternative science, but an untenable alternative to science. By adopting it, one willfully retards all progression in their own knowledge, and had it always been the means of epistemology and scientific practice, nor we, or any alleged creation scientist of the past, would have gotten anywhere.
If the question is put to me, would I rather have a miserable ape for a grandfather, or a man, highly intelligent, possessed of great means of influence, and yet who employed these faculties and that influence for the mere purpose of introducing ridicule into a grave scientific discussion, I unhesitatingly affirm my preference for the ape.